my company and the software to a point where I'm comfortable with what we've done, that we're compliant, but we're nowhere near as automated or as streamlined as we could be in meeting our obligations of GDPR. At the moment, if somebody came to me and said, I have a request for information on everything you know about me, it's still a manual process. I still have to go into my structures and try and find out all the information about that person, do a separate dump and pull it out. That should be automated. And it's one of those things which is now working like this. Bye-bye beer, bye-bye beach. Everything's serene on the top, but back of house, back-end systems, we are paddling furiously to try and get everything to the point where we need it to be. So, this presentation is GDPR and how we've applied it to our business. It's actually the same, it should be for any business, because pretty much any company runs payroll, and you're all going to have the same issues from an owner's perspective, let alone the fact that I'm selling it as a software service. So I'll take you through what we collect, how we store it, how we analyze the flow of information into and out of our business. Data protection impact assessments, as mentioned before by Alan, they're critical and key to certain types of delivery. So I actually use the same system that Alan was mentioning there. Understanding consequence of loss, understanding mitigation measures, and then the ongoing life cycle of documentation and maintenance. So what we collect, as a payroll provider, we have direct personal information that can be used to directly identify an individual. And that's the standard stuff that you'll be aware of. It's their name, their email address, their postal address, their street address, something that you look at and you go, oh, I know who that is. Then there's the level of indirect personal information. So these are the things that you could put two and two together and come up with who that person is. So we've got gender, birth date, PPSN, employer. Those things on their own would not be enough to identify somebody, but you put it with another data set or even with your own internal data set, and you can pretty quickly figure out an individual from a lineup of people. So we've got things that we monitor like job titles, office departments, regions, phone numbers, vehicle registrations, all that stuff on the left-hand column. Then we step to our next level of sensitive information, and this is the stuff that people understandably be a little bit annoyed if got out in public domain, and it's defined in the regulations. So trade union memberships, we deduct out of people's salaries and we pay a trade union. So we know their political affiliations. That's sensitive information. Medical certificates, if you're submitting leave and you've had 3 days off and your company has a mandatory policy that you need to add a doctor's certificate with that, then we store it, so we know stuff about how you're feeling. Religious donations, some people choose to tithe or to pay a church out of their salary. So we potentially have your religious beliefs as well. Then there's also the court-instructed garnishees. So that's where His Honour, Her Honour has said you've been a bad person, you need to recompense €70 a week out of your paycheck to person X. We process that, so we're aware of whether you've been a good boy or not. Then what also throws us into another level of special risk is the fact that we bulk process information. So any failure on our part has a significant potential impact on a lot of people. So that throws us into the DPIA level of submission to the Data Protection Commissioner immediately. Then there's also the potential for us to be processing minors' information. So if we're paying somebody who's selling newspapers or serving coffee and 16 years old or 15-year-olds. Actually, Alan, what is the date for that? It was redefined, wasn't it, the age? 16 now. Started out at 13. So 16 is the age of somebody who works at Run Amok or like a kid's playground. So you're dealing with minors. So the first step of our journey down GDPR was just figuring out what we collected and what we had on file. Second step is figuring out how we received it and what we do with it. In our case, employers generally will sign onto our website. They will upload information based on their employees' requirements. There's an employee self-service portal, so employees can also go in there and modify their phone number and change their address and change their voluntary contributions to pension plans, etc. Sometimes employers call us, sometimes they post us stuff. We have a messaging system within the app where they can deliver near instant communication to us as well, so that's all tracked and recorded there. And we have an API that we can receive information through. So we've got several channels of getting information in. Later on, you need to look at your risk assessments and figure out how you're going to protect those channels. On the outgoing side of things, we send emails. So we'll send you your payslip via email. We have a web page that displays a form, so you can see everything that, and if somebody's standing over your shoulder, they can see it as well. We also have an API that puts out information to other parties. So again, we had to get our head around within the business where things enter and exit our sphere of control. At that point, we had a pretty good understanding of what we knew. We had a pretty good understanding of how we got it and where we were going to take it. It was time for us to do our data protection impact assessment. We chose to host this ourselves. It's the French one that Alan was talking about before. Comes in a standalone Windows version. You can put it on your PC. We've chosen to host it on our own servers behind our own firewall because every developer and every project that we're going to be working on, if it touches somebody's personal data, they need to do an impact assessment for it. At the moment, we're just designing a software system, so we've got one great big data protection impact assessment which covers the whole gambit of what we're doing. But in the future, when we roll out a change to the login procedures, maybe put a layered approach to collecting data, that individual scope of work needs to be addressed with its own data protection impact assessment. Unfortunately for us, that also has to go to the Data Protection Commissioner. And I'll come on to about what you might include in that or not later on. Well, actually, I'll do it now. I'll move the slides around. So, in our data protection impact assessment, that tool is great because it gives you a framework of what you need to consider. I'm going to take you some things that we do and don't recommend. I personally do recommend being thorough with your risk. Now, this comes from my background as a consulting engineer where I've worked on construction projects where people have been killed. I've worked on projects where things have been damaged. Things where there's a high level of risk mitigation, but also that goes to court for litigation. So I'm aware of how judges can approach somebody's personal injury. So if you're going to define a plan for how you manage data, you should look at all the risks. It's your duty of care to look at all the risks that might sit out there. But don't plan for every eventuality. The whole key about this is being reasonable and proportional. So you want to be realistic with the consequences of that risk happening. So if somebody managed to get into our database and stole everybody's birthday, I'm not so worried about that. If they got into it and stole all of their religious beliefs or all of their bank details, I'd be a little more concerned. So you've got to look at the level of risk and consequence of each of your potential data losses. Then you've got to propose reasonable and proportional mitigation. Now, it's great as an engineer or designer, we can go out and build the Fort Knox of security system. But is that really relevant for somebody who has their Twitter feed about what they ate last week at breakfast? So the response needs to be, and your protection measures need to be adequate, but don't go over the top. Don't say that you're doing world-class stuff. Because at the end of the day, if something goes wrong and you're taken before a magistrate or a court, and they say, did you do everything that was reasonable? You can put up your hand and say, yeah, I did. I did industry good practice. But then if you hand them over your impact assessment and it said you were going to do X, Y, Z, you were going to have 5 firewalls, you were going to have somebody reviewing each and every transaction, and found out that you didn't do any of that stuff, then you rapidly go from being somebody who was being reasonable to someone who was being negligent. Because you promised you were going to do it, your customers signed up to thinking you were going to do that, and now you've just left them in the lurch and they've lost all the data. So never overstate your mitigation measures. Don't go over the top, do what's reasonable. But on the other side of it, always deliver what you're going to say. Because at the end of the day, that's what the litmus test will be. So we went through an analysis of our third-party integrations, where we kept all this information, what we were doing with it. So we had laptops. I've got one here. People have the potential to store information on laptops. Grand. We were using Trello for our Kanban and our project management, and that had potential clients' email addresses and things on that as well. That's with somebody else. Don't know where they keep the information. We just put it up there naively. We were using MailChimp for mail. Our hoster was ServerGrove. They had a Dublin data center, and everything was sweet with them. We had people storing stuff on Dropbox. Xero, our accountancy package, we were sending information to them for billing. Amazon Web Services is our backup host and our disaster recovery host. We had people using Gmail, we had Office 365 and Stripe for payment solutions. So we had a sit down and looked at what information we were sharing with our third parties. and decided we need to consolidate it, take things more in-house. So, whoops, well, I'll skip through two there. The first one to go was ServerGrove. ServerGrove actually called me up. I'd spent close to 6 months chasing them, asking for their GDPR compliance requirements and documents, saying, can you get something to me? I need it, I've got to pass this on. 2 weeks before start of May, they got back to me and said, actually, we're going to move everything to Miami. So they just got out of Dodge. They picked up the servers and exited stage left. So we changed to a company called DediServe, which is now our Irish-based data center. We were using MailChimp. Again, we decided to bring that within the EU, so we've now used Sendinblue, French company again. They seem to be doing well out of this for plugging French companies, wherever Peter is. The reason I'm choosing Sendinblue is because they've got good API integrations. And my end goal for the company is that I don't want to be giving other people my personal data. I want to be retaining it myself and interacting with the API directly, and that way I've got control of the information that I'm responsible for. There's a requirement for 72 hours turnaround on notification of a data breach. And if Sendinblue or MailChimp had a data breach and they didn't notify me within 36 hours, that clock is from when they get the data breach, not from when I maintain my clients. So I rapidly lose any scope that I've got to comply with the law about when I need to report this stuff. So I bring it as much in-house as I can. So MailChimp's gone. Sendinblue is a good alternative though. Dropbox, I dropped Dropbox. I'm now using Nextcloud, which is an open source cloud storage system, and we're hosting that ourselves. One of the benefits of Nextcloud is it's a very good cloud-based management system. It also comes bundled with other systems such as an email system and a Kanban board. So we got rid of Trello because Nextcloud does that as well. Then the email system, we built our own email host within DediServe, so we got rid of Gmail and Microsoft Office. So now I'm getting down to my core business. We're looking at laptops, still a problem, but over time we're going to convert to thin clients. Most of the ongoing staff in our business don't need to be developers. They don't need massive computing power. They need to be answering questions, interfacing with clients. They don't need USB ports. They don't need hard drives. So I'm going to, one of our employees at the moment is already working on a Raspberry Pi. That's the Element 14 Raspberry Pi box. And very soon he's going to find some blue tack stuffed in the back of his USB ports. So we're down to thin clients, our own hosts, encrypted hosts, our own managed document management system, Xero accountancy, Amazon Web Service for backup, and disaster recovery and Stripe for payments. And that's my core team, I guess, when it comes to delivering the project. This is my infrastructure diagram. I kind of glossed over this at the last presentation I did because it was mostly business owners, but this crowd is probably more attuned to what we're looking at. Privacy, not security, as Alan mentioned before. This is largely about security and about good practice, and it's about having separation of concerns so that you're splitting up your servers and your systems according to what they should be doing and not hosting everything on one server or having free access between different servers. So we use a lot of firewalls between every service. We use fail to ban extensively on any external facing IP address. So that if there's repeated failures, we're banning people straight away, well, within 3 attempts. We've got the databases down the bottom are obviously all replicated and fail over. Load balancers, as you'd be aware, for multiple app servers. File servers being kept separately, our own internal file service separately, email service separately. And then another important thing is your monitoring process. Now, we use Elk Stack. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but it's a great tool. So every server reports to the Elk Stack. It's basically a log management system using Elasticsearch, which is excellent for interrogating data sets. So one of your requirements as a software provider, as a cloud service provider, is to be able to track intrusions. So we've got Securitor, which is takes a snapshot of your drive, and if anything changes, lets you know what's changed. So you can monitor things as they go, and this all goes back to the Elk Stack and gets reported to the admins. And then this little bogey down the bottom left-hand side here, that's my bugbear at the moment, is the backup server, and everything going to the backup servers, which then goes to Amazon Glacier, depending on how it ages. The proportional response, the letter of the law response is I should be able to delete somebody from my backups if they ask for a deletion from my data set. That's just way too much hassle, and I don't know how I'm going to do it other than just aging the data sets over time and the backups over time. Any questions so far? Yes?
You got a request for a right to be forgotten, for example, and you're not going to touch the backups.
Yeah.
By the time your logs age, you could well be past the time period that you have.
The period for responding, yes.
40 days.
Yeah, you need to basically send a letter straight away, which ticks the early part of that. I'd love to see it tested, because I don't know how people are going to go back and spin up all of their old backups, whether they've got a daily, like we do a 3-hourly backup, a daily backup, weekly backup, monthly backup. And I'm thinking about a 3-monthly, but we'll see how that goes. But that's 4 sets of backups. And then you look at the period cycles on those, daily is every day, so you've got 7 of those. And it's just unrealistic to spin those all up and cleanse them and then create your backups again. Proportional response, yeah. So how do we store? We've identified our data, we've identified how it travels in and out of our business, we've identified how we store it within our business. In writing Párolla, I've taken a lot of sit on the shoulders of others, basically, by using a lot of open source software. And so my little contribution back to the open source community is a GDPR bundle for Symfony, which we use internally, and then I've made it public so that others can contribute to it and use it themselves. We're up to about 500 applications running it at the moment. But the point of the GDPR bundle is that I like the concept of bundling. It's very similar to microservices in that you're taking the concerns out to individual packages and dealing things with separately. The bundle for GDPR for us relies on encryption, identification, aging, anonymization, and then reporting. So this is our abstracted data layer. So Symfony, we use MySQL as our database. Over the top of that is Doctrine as the abstraction layer, which interfaces with and builds your database commands. Symfony uses an entity, which then creates information for that abstraction layer. So my concept for putting the responsibility of, categorizing the level of data is to make that onus sit with the developer. So anybody who wants to write and store and persist a piece of information in the software has to go to the developer to write that. So when they're writing the entity to react with the database, they're the person that makes that end decision about whether it's personal or not. And that's where we store that data. So we created a new data type. You'll be familiar with whether it's going to be a text or an int or a date time object. All those are different types of objects you can store in a database. We've created our own, which is a personal data object, which really it's just an array that gets wrapped around a personal data object and serialized. So this array is, I'm going to move to the board here. It contains the information that you need to address from a GDPR requirement. So we've got the column is the column table column, the format of data you want to keep, whether or not it's sensitive data. So is this one of the ones about people's gender, about their political affiliation? Then whether you're going to encrypt that column separately, or if your risk analysis decided it wasn't worth encrypting, leave it unencrypted. But you can make the choice here within the abstraction layer as to whether you want to do that. Next method is information of how you received, how this piece of data would be used to identify somebody, whether it's a directly identifiable piece of information, like their name, or an indirectly identifiable piece, such as their PPS number. There's a bit of a human readable version about what you could do with that data if you had a breach. There's a piece about where you've received that data from, who gave it to you. So in this case, it was an IBAN, a banking code. So normally that's given to us by the employee or by the employer. There's two rates, two providers. It records why we keep it. Why do we have to have that piece of information? So the developers sitting there as they're writing this, they're going, actually, do I need that? I've got to fill in the box. Do I need this or not? Because it'll make my life easier if I don't have it. The next point is how long are you going to retain that for? 6 years for me is a legal requirement, so that's a straightforward one. Other people might find it that's 3 months or 8 months or a year. Then there's another set of information, which is how you dispose of that information at the end of that expiry period. So we've got a couple of classes for disposal of information. There's aggregate into decades. So say it was somebody's birth date, you might aggregate that into 50s, 60s, 70s, whatever. There's set null. If you don't need that information at all after 6 years, just set it as empty. There might be anonymize, which is create a random piece of gibberish and throw it in there. So you can create your own different versions of anonymization that you want to implement after that 6-year period. Then there's a bit of transactional information, the method of receipt. How do we get this information? In this case, the IBAN was delivered over HTTPS, so TLS encrypted form, which was the next level. Receipt protection. How do we protect that information as it came in? How do we return that information? We return it via, again, a HTTPS page that we demonstrate and show to somebody. We also PDF it. And then how are we protecting that return method? We're using encryption and we're providing an encrypted PDF. So that data is all sitting there inside our abstracted layer. So that when you start using another tool within the GDPR bundle is a reporting tool. And you can run GDPR report from the browser of the app, and it, if you're an admin, and it pulls down every table in our database, and then it defines all of those parameters against that table. So you can instantly see all the data we collect stored within the database, and then if any of those are expiry periods, if the why you've got it, how long you're keeping it for, that information comes up to the user quite straightforward. Mike, do you want me to carry on with this, or is that too much detail on technical stuff? Resounding silence? Give me a yes or a no. Yeah, okay, right. So it's an event-driven solution. So if whenever you, on a load event of accessing data from the information from the database, it fires an event. And you can then capture that in your bundle and do what you want with it, whether you want to pre-process or post-process that data before you take it from the database or send it back. We have, if it's encrypted, obviously it populates your entity with unencrypted information, and then before it persists it back to the database again, it re-encrypts it. Don't lose that encryption key, as you'll be aware. Happened once on the test site and lost everything. Oh, it's another thing. Don't use live data on test sites. Use Faker or use some sort of data generation tool, because accidents happen. You find that test sites are left open to the web because a vhost hasn't been configured properly. Never use live data on a test site. And then, so there's the reporting out of that. I think I've covered everything. I'm going to move on. So a lot of what I've been talking about with how we approach our data protection measures aren't actually new issues. Nothing is really, aside from the database object that we've created for Párolla, nothing's particularly outstanding as new. If I look around the outside of our mitigation measures that we've implemented arising from the DPIA, segregation of concerns, that's not a new concept, it's been around for ages. Our servers are encrypted, again, nothing unusual about that. Our traffic between servers, we host our services in the same physically secure location, but our traffic between servers is also encrypted. That's not unusual. Host selection is a little bit unusual. Before GDPR, I would have thought nothing about going to America for a host. Now I'm more inclined to keep it within the EU, just because it simplifies my life, not because there's any necessarily a problem with it. It just makes my disclosure a lot simpler. Use of firewalls, nothing new there. Use of IP whitelists, again, all of our firewalls, we deny everyone by default, and we whitelist only our known servers, with the exception of the load balancer, which is open to port 80 for anyone. All our servers obviously have security certificates on them. Let's Encrypt, nice free security certificate tool. Access control lists, again, I'm using fail to ban to block out malicious people or people who come on repeatedly. Where we start getting to more GDPR related things, I've put a little blue star next to it. We're encrypting our sensitive data, and we're encrypting some of our personal data too. Now that's a technical overhead that you don't necessarily need. And again, it comes down to your proportional response to the risk of losing that data. But in our instance, given the nature of our business, we felt that encryption at column level was appropriate. We, like your banks, have privacy timeouts. You know, you go and get a cup of tea and come back and find that Bank of Ireland has signed you out of your screen for your own protection. We also have idle logouts, so that if you walk away from your laptop or your screen for more than 2 minutes, I think it is, it goes blank and no one can look at what you're working on. A bit more on the output files. Obviously, we're encrypting all our output files now, so we encrypt with 2 passwords. We have a business password and we have a user password. So if you're an employee and you receive your payslip, you'll get one which is your own password choosing. And then obviously the business owner gets their own password that they could look at their payslip as well. Copious logging everything, because there's the requirement that you understand when you've had a breach, and that's one of the biggest things, is actually knowing when you've been compromised. So along with logging, you need somebody who understands the method of interrogating those logs, and that's where the elk stack is helpful with setting up some flags on when your logs start looking abnormal. Controlled access to client data. Now this is an internal mitigation measure to stop the old police force going in and checking out what their neighbours' speeding tickets look like. We don't want our staff being able to see other people's pay information for somebody they might know 3 blocks away, or their relations. So we have very strict policies about only being able to work on the information of a business when they give you the consent to work on that information. So if somebody came to us, a client came to us and said, hey, can you check this payroll, it doesn't look right, we need to get written consent from them via a forms authorising us to go in and have a look at that data for them. Now, you can't protect everything, but first line support staff similarly shouldn't be able to see everything. Your database administrator is going to be able to interrogate the database. You can't get away from that, and if they've got the skills, they'll look at the information they need. But it's about controlling the level of access that your own staff have to that information as well. Intrusion detection, I mentioned that earlier, no point going on there. Breach reports, that's something new. And for us, it's important to notify the Data Protection Commissioner as well as the clients when there's been a breach on our part, but also on any of our suppliers. And that comes back to the point earlier on where I tried to limit my supplier set, because I'm trying to bring things closer into control so that our breach reporting process is more timely and direct. Portability and transfer, that's been a nightmare for me, and I'm still not quite there. So one of the requirements of GDPR is that people should be able to take their data away and go off to the next supplier down the street and give it to them, and everything would be read comfortably in a machine-readable format and work accurately. Now, to my knowledge, there is no payroll-related common data format for exporting of information. So our approach to this at the moment is just to export everything in Excel spreadsheets. And you can CSV that, you can import it however you want to, but if you've got an industry standard for the transmit of data, you need to be aware of it and be able to submit and receive in the same format. A data expiry is a new one. I mentioned how we were doing that before. Backup cleansing, not quite sure how I'm going to do that. Anonymization, again, I'm not quite sure how I'm working with some of those issues at the end of that 6-year period, because we're not there yet. So this is where the fathoms are going underneath the water, because we're still working about the process of how exactly we're going to anonymize all this data when it expires. It's not an imminent concern for me. Going forward, how we manage the business when it grows. Now, we're a small business at the moment. We don't have a lot of staff to have to deal with, but you need to start getting your company policies in order. Because again, if there's a breach from your organisation that's found to be one of your staff, which is the source of the breach, you're looking at somebody interrogating, well, how did you train them? How did you give them guidance on what they should be doing? How did you reinforce that to them every 6 months, because they're forgetful and they need to be told not to print out everybody's payslips and leave them at the communal printer. So you need to protect your business from that perspective of being able to stand up in court and say, I was doing what was reasonable. We use GitHub just for hosting our documents because it's great for seeing the change and evolution over time, and everyone in the company has access to it. So there's the ongoing maintenance process, and again within Nextcloud you can set up tasks. So we have a reoccurring task schedule which will be running the regular expiry of data, updating your DPIA for ongoing process, monitoring your logs, reporting your breaches, responding to requests for information and transfer of information, reporting to the board, which is your requirement. Now we don't have a board, but if you're big enough to have a board, that's what you'll be doing. And then the ongoing auditing and monitoring of your logs and your elk stack. So that's where we're at. I probably rushed through that. If there's any questions, please feel free to ask. Otherwise, thanks for your time and thanks for coming out. It's kind of a bit dark now, but sacrificing your evening.
Can you talk about data expiry a little bit more?
Sure.
What are the actual details of what
Yeah, so we have a cron task which sits in the back of our database. So a cron is just an automated process for running scripts. And every month that goes through and trawls the expiry date on the data objects and says, are we past 6 years? If we are, trigger the anonymization process which was defined in that data set.
6 years is the GDPR thing.
6 years is a legal requirement for us to be holding tax records for people. You, if you're running a social media site, might expire things 3 months. It might be a business-related requirement for doctors to have it 14 years. Whatever it might be that suits either a legal requirement, so the legal minimum for us is 6 years, but you might have a reasonable requirement. And keeping something for 50 years, probably not reasonable in most cases. I actually like that. It's causing us to dump a whole lot of stuff that we wouldn't necessarily need to keep and actually use. So after that period of time, which you've defined in a date time interval format, so P6Y, P1M, something like that, the cron task will go through, and if it finds something which is expired, it will then trigger the directed anonymization method, which might be set null. Now, on the front end at our GUI, we've got a personal data. Does anyone use Twig? Twig's like a HTML rendering script. And basically you pass an object and it will convert that object into a string output that you can display in your HTML. So our Twig object for converting a personal data object will look at that personal data thing and say, if it's expired, I will display the anonymized information. If it's sensitive, and it's been encrypted, I will decrypt it. If the anonymization method was decades, I will turn a date object into a decade object. If it's, and it looks at what your anonymization method is and substitutes that information into the HTML render instead of what is the expired data. That expired data is gone, doesn't exist anymore. So you have to put something in there. You can't just, when you're building your form or your web page, you can't just leave it for a type mismatch error, because what was a date object is now suddenly a string and everything goes kaput. So that's how that deals with the expiration. Yes, Alan.
Question and a comment. You mentioned encryption, transit, and unrest. You're actually encrypting on the field level as well.
Yes.
How are you managing your keys?
We use GUIDs for all our keys. It's expensive.
The encryption keys themselves.
Oh, the encryption keys. So the encryption key has to stay with the app server because that's where the logic is. But the encryption key doesn't exist on our database servers. And our flow of information set up by the firewalls means if you're on the database server, you can't get to the app server. So you'd have to lose the database information. You'd also have to concurrently lose the encryption key, which is stored on the app server, which is a separate server. The two only speak via encrypted MySQL and queries. So yeah, if the database administrator took everything, they still don't have the encryption key. All right, well, thank you for your time. Richard, if you want to close.